It didn't occur to me particularly that this could get me killed to start with. So I wasn't worried too much until I actually started to have genuine brushes with death. The saliva was flying out of his mouth. It really felt like he was going to injure me. And I thought, with this sword to my throat, that's it, I'm going to die. I'm Neil Woods. I'm a former undercover drugs operative.
So talk to me about how you first got involved in undercover work.
It was an accident getting involved in undercover work, really, because I joined the police flippantly, really, because I went to university by mistake, found myself studying something I hated, and so I dropped out, much to my parents' dismay. Went into the police and found myself in uniform being terrible at the job. I really was not a very good uniform cop. I only stayed in for just to prove that I could survive the training. I managed to get to 4 years service, and then I got an attachment to the drug squad. Right at the point when a new type of undercover work was about to be developed, called level 2 undercover work. And one of them looked at me and said, "Do you fancy having a go at buying some crack cocaine?" Which wasn't a question I was exactly expecting, but I thought, yeah, why not? I'll give it a go. An ops point was very quickly set up, bit of surveillance, and I was given a £20 note and pointed to go knock on a particular door. I remember knocking on this door and seeing this huge guy who was the drug dealer I was targeting. He says, "What do you want?" "Who are you? You're not a student, are you?" Fucking hate students. And I thought, I actually don't know who I am. They hadn't told me to get a story ready. So I thought, that'll do. "Yeah, I'm a student." And he said, "Are you stupid? I've just told you I hate students." But anyway, we found it funny, and eventually he sold me some crack. He even let me choose which little wrap I wanted after it out of his hand. And as I was walking away, he stopped me and said, "Hey, you be careful, don't you get yourself arrested?" Which I thought was quite considerate, really.
Why did they send you to this person's house, and what was the outcome of that?
Well, this person was known for dealing heroin and crack cocaine at the time. He was a particular target of the drug squad in Derby. And it was just rolling the dice, really. It was the very beginning of the development of that kind of undercover work. And the outcome was, I bought off him another few times, and he got, I think, 5 years in jail because he'd got previous convictions for dealing. He'd got previous convictions for GBH with intent and all sorts of things. But that was the beginning of, it changed my life, really, because for the drug squad, they realised that this was an easy way to get big numbers and increase their productivity. That's the lens that they saw it through, really. I developed it quite quickly. I went from doing a few days operation to a few weeks, and in no time at all, I was doing 6 or 7 months of operations. I was being loaned to other drug squads and travelling all over the country doing that work. It didn't occur to me particularly that this could get me killed to start with. I thought I could probably get injured, but that didn't worry me too much. So I wasn't worried too much until I actually started to have genuine brushes with death.
What was your first genuine brush with death?
My first the first 2 times I thought I was going to die was on the same day. It was in the city of Stoke-on-Trent in Fenton, and I'd been buying heroin off this dealer in increasing weights, and I thought he was perfectly happy with me. I'd been buying off him for weeks. I knocked on his door, and this time he opened the door and put a samurai sword to my throat, and he was screaming at me and shouting. He says, "You're 5-0, you're filth, you're drug squad, I know you are." And the saliva was flying out of his mouth. It really felt like he was going to injure me. And I thought, with this sword to my throat, that's it, I'm going to die. And I sort of mumbled, "Well, I don't mean to hassle you, mate." And then I heard this woman laughing, and this head sort of popped up behind him. And then the two of them started laughing. They were winding me up. So I don't know, maybe he had a new sword he wanted to try out, or maybe more likely it was just the sort of pattern of behaviour where they're just reminding people who's boss, and building this reputation of unpredictable, violent behaviour. But it convinced me, because I genuinely thought I might die. Anyway, I bought some heroin off him, did a bit of haggling, more haggling than normal. And as I was walking away, putting 4 bags of heroin into a cigarette packet, I look up and there's a knife near my stomach, with this black handle like a kitchen knife. There's someone trying to rob me for the heroin I'd just bought. And again, I thought, I might die here. I might actually die for this heroin. But then I thought, there's no way I'm giving up this heroin after what I've just been through. So I started running backwards, I thought, I can get away from this guy. And as I was running away, this guy with the knife said, no, hang on, just come here a minute. I thought, no. And we had this sort of comic thing. Do you remember as a kid, if someone was chasing you, you'd go the other side of a car and you'd sort of dodge one way and then the other. We had that kind of standoff around a car for a little bit before I decided to run away and just leave him to it. But yeah, so that was the first 2 times.
You mentioned going back to these drug dealers multiple times over multiple weeks or months. Why do you have to do that? Why can't you just go to them once, say they're obviously selling drugs, and then bust them?
Well, quite often, because it's such, it became such a investment in resources, all of the support around me that had to be developed as the tactics developed, it sort of made it more cost effective to try and catch more than one dealer and to try and catch people who were linked. Now, the rules say that you can't use undercover work unless you've exhausted all of the means of investigating these suspects, or other police investigations are not practicable, essentially. It's a nuclear option of policing. It's like if nothing else works. And so if you've got a gang or a network of people in an area, then it's the only way to be able to gather evidence against all of them and gather evidence of conspiracy. So in other words, it can be really, really complicated. Who knows who's buying off who's the boss? You know, those kind of things you can only really find out by detailed investigation. And a lot of that meant actually spending time with not just the problematic consumers who were selling, but the actual gangsters, and mingling with them to work out what exactly was going on.
What's the most dangerous gang you've ever infiltrated or spent time with?
Oh, that's an easy question to answer. That's the Burger Bar boys. I'd been doing the job probably over 10 years, and I'd actually given up doing it because the previous operation had been emotionally really difficult. One of the people that I got to know and befriended ended up being suicidal when he was in police custody. And the reason that he was suicidal, as he told the investigating officers, he said that he thought I was his one friend in the world. Finally, the first person he'd ever been able to talk to about his problems. So that that hit me so hard that I'd given up undercover work. But then, as I'm so good at manipulating other people, I was myself manipulated into going back and doing another job. And it was the DS said to me, look, Woodsy, we need you to do this job because this gang is even more vicious than the last lot that you did. And it's this gang called the Burger Bar Boys. And just a few months before I started this operation, they'd infamously murdered these 2 young women in Birmingham. They were notorious for the war with the Johnson crew, a rival gang, and the main target of the operation was implicated in 7 separate murders. So I felt duty bound to do this job because they were causing all sorts of carnage. And I spent a few weeks building up a legend, a reputation of someone who traded in stolen property before I've managed to get an introduction to them. And the introduction was terrifying. The guy that I'd persuaded to introduce me directly to them was shaking, visibly shaking. He walked with a walking stick and his stick was tapping on the ground because he was shaking that much, and cold sweat dripping off his forehead. And I thought, wow, this doesn't bode well if he's that terrified. It was in the toilets of a snooker club in Northampton. And this first hooded figure came in, and he went into the toilet cubicle, stood on the toilet and looked over the top and said, what's this? And then 4 more hooded figures came in and they started walking around me slowly and sort of digging me in the ribs. And one of them headbutted me on the ear. I think it was headbutting me on the ear. They were hitting me and I was getting jostled around. All the time this guy's looking down at me and asking me questions. Then he was looking at my mate, asking him questions to try and catch us out. It was genuinely terrifying. Anyway, eventually he said to me, okay, what do you want? And I said, I'll have 1-on-1, please. Meaning I'll have some crack and some heroin. Gave him the money. And we exchanged phone numbers. So it was quite a surprise to me because it moved it along much quicker than I was expecting. I didn't expect to get his phone number straight away. All of the time I spent with them, and I spent more time with them than I wanted to, at every point I felt unsafe in their company. Like every single day I thought my life was at risk. And one day, in fact, they stripped me. They said, strip, you're 5-0, man. You're filth, you're 5-0. And when I was starting to say no, one of them lifted his t-shirt up and showed me a gun tucked into his tracksuit bottoms. And 2 weird thoughts came into my head. And it's just the way my brain works on adrenaline, I think. First one was, you're not old enough to have seen a Y50. And the other one was, when I was looking at the gun thinking, how on earth are those tracksuit bottoms holding that gun up? But anyway, that's just the way my mind works. But they stripped me at gunpoint, they threatened me. Yeah, they were uncomfortable, or very uncomfortable to deal with.
What was the outcome of that operation?
After 7 months, I developed a real dislike for these people. I was really pleased to be catching them, and I don't know if you've ever seen a TV drama where you're in like the office or this was the secret location, but there was loads of whiteboards, and in a drama where you see all the whiteboards with photographs and all the lines between them, it's exactly like that. But I was looking at the whiteboards and the lists of names. There was evidence against 96 people. So there was the 6 main Burger Bar boys who were the main targets, but 90 other people that was involved. And I remember looking at these boards thinking, wow, this is just going to sweep the place clean. This is going to have such an impact. Such an impact. There was hundreds of police involved in the arrest phase from all of the surrounding counties. Massive operation. And when the dust had settled, the intel officer, who was the dedicated intel guy for the operation, was tasked with keeping his ear to the ground as to the impact. And he spoke to me afterwards, a week or so later, and says, yep, we managed to interrupt the drug supply for a full 2 hours. 7 months of work, being quite convinced I was going to die on multiple occasions. Hundreds of cops involved, huge amounts of resources to interrupt the heroin and crack cocaine supply for 2 hours. That's all it took for the new number and a new gang to take over.
So did they arrest the entire gang?
Yeah, the entire gang was arrested. The 6 main people who got 9 and 10 years in prison, plus 90 other people, although they're runners, people doing the stashing, logistics, all the sex workers who were working for them, the whole lot that gathered evidence against.
Why was it only 2 hours?
Police actions like this, it doesn't matter how big they are, how many people you arrest or how many piles of drugs you seize, that never reduces the size of the market. The size of the market stays the same. And that's an important distinction because we need to be looking at this through an economic lens. It doesn't reduce the size of the market. And if the market is there, demand will be met. So it doesn't stop anyone from getting their drugs of choice. No police activity stops anyone getting their drug of choice. This is what the reality we need to face up to. I had to learn this the hard way from a decade and a half of undercover work. But what does happen, because obviously it's a lot of energy for police to put into that market, if it doesn't reduce the size of the market, what does it do? It changes the shape of that market. So you create a gap, and that gap is fought over because it's so lucrative. So often you get an increase in violence in a community in the wake of police activity like that. Or it changes the shape of the market by creating monopolies, because the gang that's most able to take up that opportunity is a rival, so they can increase their market share. If they increase their market share, they have more disposable income, and more disposable income gets invested in corruption, and so the whole system just gets worse.
So there's actually no way to stop drug gangs?
Not within the regime of prohibition, no. The only way we can have any impact is through legal regulation, taking legal control. It's the only way.
Can you explain that?
Prohibition is a relatively recent experiment in human existence. There are examples of it. With alcohol prohibition, there was 13 years of alcohol prohibition in the United States. And all it did is give birth to organised crime. And what makes organised crime powerful now is the prohibition of the other drugs. Alcohol is actually the most dangerous if you look at them comparatively and the harm that it causes to society. But that one's legal. And because it's legal, we can have some regulatory control over it. We can decide where it's sold, how old you have to be to buy it. You can control that and enforce it with ID. You can decide what premises can do it, what circumstances, what time the license is allowed to be open to. So once you've got it regulated, then you can tweak regulatory control. So for the other drugs, we need to regulate each drug according to its relative risk. So heroin, for example, you would only really have a medical control of that, like they do in Switzerland. Switzerland brought in medical control of heroin in 1994, which meant if you're addicted, you get a clean supply of heroin, which means organised crime can't exploit you. It means the market doesn't grow, no one dies, no children are dealing it like we have in the UK. And for the other drugs, cannabis is a bit more complicated, but it's the one that will happen the first in the UK because it's happening elsewhere. But we need to do it right. We need to make sure there isn't corporate capture. We need to do it for public health, not commercial profit. And the other drugs in between, well, MDMA. There wouldn't be any deaths of MDMA if it was legally regulated, because all of the deaths are because it's something else in the tablet, or the tablet's got 4 doses in it. Once you've got regulatory control, it would be much safer. And if people want to go and dance in a field for a few hours on MDMA, why do I care? As long as they don't die and they're safe, right? It's not addictive. Particularly, it's one of the least addictive drugs. Same goes for the psychedelics. Psychedelics, we understand now, are good for wellness. They can be very good for many people in terms of actually maintaining mental health or repairing it. Should that be illegal? Should it be controlled by organised crime or licensed pharmacies and doctors?
Did you ever have to try any of these drugs yourself to maybe avoid suspicion?
I did. Not many times, thankfully, because that was one of the scariest things that I did, if I'm honest. I once had to pretend to inhale heroin from someone giving me a blowback. And that was scary because I was just thinking, please don't let him see the smoke coming out the side of my cheeks. I was just like, yeah, sure, I'll take a heroin blowback, fine. But the worst one was when I was doing this operation in Leicestershire, and it was this pub. It was like some parody, you know, if it was on a TV drama, you'd think, no, that's not believable. Because basically it was gangsters meeting from Derby, Nottingham, and Leicester in this village pub. It was insane. And the main target was involved in antiques burglaries, organised massive amounts of car theft, but also dealing massive amounts of cocaine. Now, the mistake I made for this operation is I made myself out to be a connoisseur of amphetamines. That was part of my legend. But unfortunately, I'm not at all. But it was something to talk about. You know, I could talk about Dexies or the difference between methamphetamine and something else. One day, this main target came to me and said, hey, you, I've got a present for you. And he held up this little see-through bag with this toxic looking pink goo in it. And I could see he expected me to take it. And a moment of reticence must have flashed across my face because I saw a moment of suspicion flash across his face. So I thought, shit, I've got to pour water on that flame of suspicion quickly. So I thought, great, yeah, smile and show some enthusiasm, dip my little finger in, got a bit, put it in my mouth. And he looked at me and said, with your tolerance, you'll need more than that. I thought, no. So I put it in, put some more in my mouth. I could feel the mouth ulcer forming in my tongue, you know, as it burned. And in no time at all, I felt this warm feeling in my stomach. And within 15 minutes, I was rushing my tits off. And I had to get out of there. I had to make my excuses saying, yeah, I'm going on to party now, thanks. Got to the secret location and I had to say, look, I've had this speed. It's rushing like hell. So I quickly had to dictate my notes because I was quickly unable to write and I had to get driven home. Now, I knew enough about drugs that it's quite hard to overdose dangerously on amphetamines, but it's quite easy to overdose enough to have a really bad time. So I knew I didn't need the hospital, but I was in hell. I was so anxious. It was horrendous. Speed at the time was about 5% pure on average. This was 40%. So I remember being driven home thinking, I've got 8 cans of lager in my fridge. It's gonna be fun. That'll take the edge off. It'll be great. And I remember getting home, drinking, finishing the 8th can, thinking I don't feel any different at all. Any different. I didn't sleep properly for 3 nights. That's how strong it was. It was horrific. Mind you, my house has never been so tidy. At the time when I was doing the work, it didn't occur to me at all that it would be mentally damaging. At all. No one told me that. And I remember with all the near-death experiences, they were terrifying at the time, but quite quickly afterwards, I would think, well, it boosted my ego, you know. I was a young man thinking, wow, I'm someone who can do this, right? So it boosted my sense of self. But clearly, those times of near-death experiences and also the rest of the work I did caused me some real mental health problems because nowadays I'm diagnosed with chronic complex PTSD and moral injury. So my brain's a bit of a mess and I've spent many years trying to unravel that mess. But what is damaging is the harm that it caused other people. Because what I would do is I would go into a community of people and I would look for the most vulnerable person. And the reason I would zone in on the most vulnerable person is because they were the easiest to manipulate. They were the easiest to get them to do exactly what I needed. And I needed people to put themselves at risk to introduce me to the next level of people and keep doing that. And as I think I've already mentioned, one of those people overtly became suicidal. And I realized looking back that all of those vulnerable people I manipulated, I've caused harm to because a lot of them got arrested as a result. And I was good at befriending people. You know, by manipulating people, you manipulate people's emotions and you befriend them. And that was a lot of people who needed a friend. Really, genuinely. They were on the fringes of society. They were trying to self-medicate with their childhood trauma with these drugs. That's why they were using drugs problematically. And there was I coming along being their friend. And so that sort of profound sense of guilt went beyond guilt. It went into what now is recognised as moral injury. I have caused harm to other people, and in so doing, compromised my own sense of ethics and morality. But and even though I was aware of that at the time, that I was compromising myself, I kept going by telling myself that the end justified the means. Because what I was doing was good, because I was making society safer by catching these gangsters. So I justified it to myself because but in hindsight, it can never be justified. One, because the work didn't make society safer anyway, only made it more dangerous. So I learned that later on. And when I did learn that and realised that I'd just been making society more dangerous, then of course I had to face up to the fact that I'd been harming these vulnerable people.
Was there one person that you met undercover whose story stayed with you forever?
I mean, there's so many people whose stories will stay with me forever, but there was one in Northampton, and it was the Burger Bar boys' job. I decided to have a day of rattling, of really struggling, just to make my story a bit more vulnerable, not letting people have something suspicious to latch onto. So I went out early in the morning, pretending to be rattling, to be withdrawing. And I met up with someone who I'd known and got to know. And she was a young woman whose street name was Uma. And I'd got to know her, and she was a fascinating character because she said to me, I can stop using heroin. In fact, every few weeks I do stop to bring my tolerance down. But the problem is, she said, when I stop using heroin, I remember the feeling of my uncle's fingernails when he sexually abused me as a little girl. And this was one of the multiple times I realised that this was a pragmatic decision to stay on heroin for these people who are traumatised, because it medicates trauma for them. And that's a rational response to trauma that might kill you. This woman would get suicidal when she remembered her trauma. But anyway, this day that I saw her, I was obviously good at acting of being I was rattling, because she says, "Oh mate, are you hanging out? Are you in need?" I went, "Yeah." And she pulled out a £5 note from her pocket and said, "Oh, there you go, have a fiver." I says, "Well, you're going to need this." And I knew it was the only fiver she had on her. I said, "You're going to need it, mate." And she says, "No, well, I've just had some, so I'm going to make a tenner up in the next 4 or 5 hours. Don't worry, you have it. Your need is greater than mine." And that pure generosity is hard to see in any other community. It's almost like the biblical reference. I'm not particularly religious, but it's a helpful reference, I think, of the widow's mite, where the merchants were laughing at the widow for only giving this tiny coin. And the point was that's her only coin. And this pure generosity in that community is really common, because it's people who are absolutely living hand to mouth, who are really struggling with life, but they're really quick to look out for somebody else they perceive to be struggling equally.
Do you know what happened to Uma?
I don't know what happened to her. I'm pretty sure she was arrested within the structure of that operation, and I hope she's okay.
Was there a specific moment where you realised this isn't for me anymore?
I think it was probably a sign of the fact that for my last few operations, I was already suffering from PTSD. So my judgment was impaired. And I was realising that I was causing harm and the things weren't right, but I was just pushing those things to one side and just keeping going, because when you're in that world of covert policing and the people you're working with, it's hard to get off the treadmill, if you know what I mean. Even though the bombshell of the lack of impact of the Burger Bar boys was with me, I still did another operation, and then I saw that I had to get away from it, because it was an operation in Brighton. They were using homeless people as proxy dealers to sort of prevent the police from catching the actual dealers. And some of the people, there was an increase in overdoses. Now at the time, Brighton had the biggest amount of overdoses per capita for any place in the UK. But I was being told by other homeless people, some people, that some of these were murders because they'd crossed the wrong gang. Some of the people I was dealing with were saying, "Well, I can't take you to introduce them because they've told me if I bring anyone within sight of them that they've not given an okay to, I'll be killed and it'll look like an overdose." So this was sort of the last straw for me, because the people I was working with, I mean, I worked with some good cops over the years. I can't say that these were, because they were just full of stigma. They were talking horribly about the people who are using heroin problematically, or maybe I'd just got oversensitive by that point, or properly sensitive. And I didn't enjoy working with the cops I was working with. I was seeing much more humanity with the people on the streets than I was with the cops I was working with. And it just got too much because they wouldn't take it seriously, the fact that these people were dying of overdoses. And maybe some of it was even murder. Because one of them said, oh, well, if another one of them dies, just shoplifting will go down today. And that was the response. So that, I think, tipped me over the edge. Not long after that, I realised I had to get out of the job. I tried to change things from the inside. I tried to change things a bit as a detective sergeant. But attempts to try and change things within policing was just driving me insane, quite literally. So I realised I had to get out. And the only way I could be active and speak publicly to try and change things was on the outside. So I resigned to be an activist.
Can you tell us about that and what you're doing now? Yeah,
so I quickly discovered that I wasn't alone. I'm not the only cop to have come to these conclusions. There's actually a lot of us. I'm part of an international organisation called the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. And so I'm a member of that organisation. I speak all over the world at conferences. I've published 2 books. I write for various publications. I do lots of social media. And I'm very, very grateful to anybody who wants to interview me and talk about these things and dig a little bit deeper. So thank you for that.
After everything you've seen, what's the biggest misconception the public has about drugs and crime?
After all I've seen, well, there's many misconceptions, but the most important misconception that the public has about drugs and crime is that prohibition works, that it has any benefit at all. And the reason that is that the public is constantly lied to, constantly lied to by the police, which is unfortunate, but it's true. You know, when you get senior police officers saying, look at this big seizure of drugs, we've made society safer by keeping this off the streets. No, you haven't, because it's not interrupted the supply at all. If the police actually interrupt us, or the Navy or Customs interrupt a shipment of cocaine across the Atlantic, it just means that shipment's not paid for. Organised crime just send another shipment out and say, don't worry about it. It's covered in our business losses. So that's the biggest misconception, that it does any good. And the second is that the public need to realise it's only causing harm, and that harm's going to keep getting worse. Our communities are going to continue to be less safe or feel less safe until we take control of the drug markets.